I also would like to tell you that using consistent names of everything that you have to identify, after all, technically, all all names that you use in the software, technically from the compiler standpoint, become an identifier of a class, an identifier of a variable, an identifier of object reference, and so forth and so forth, including, file names, after all, and package names, and many other things. So using consistent names overall will help you also to maintain your software. Sometimes you have to rename things. Sometimes you have to adjust the way your naming convention goes. And sometimes this can be system-wide changes. And if you're very consistent in how you do it, there's a very high likelihood that you will be able to identify all places where your changes should be taking place. So naming everything consistently and successfully is a great skill, and you need to be careful about that. So don't be sloppy in naming the way you name your objects and classes in software. Keeping scope small, I think we covered that to some extent. But in overall, what I would say that when you write code, right, just to keep it brief, today, when you write your code, as soon as the size of the method that you're writing kind of runs away from you from a single screen, this should be a warning sign that perhaps your method is becoming too big and needs to be split into subsections, which means that it may be split into multiple methods being invoked by this particular methods. For example, you could sometimes, if I want to make a call into a method named compute payroll for a small company or small business, then perhaps there will be highly recognizable parts such that initialize data first, gather all the information, then process everything, then do some cleanup and database updates. So those parts in that single and huge method are great candidates to become separate methods which can be called from here, and therefore the individual methods inside of our classes can be made more maintainable, more usable. All right, so also what this particular slide suggests is that if you have a certain variable that is only being used by one single method, it should probably not be made. It should not be made an instance attribute, but rather it should become a method attribute, because you really don't want to create extra pieces in your classes that simply take away space in your object, whereas their true lifetime should be only inside a method where you want to use a temporary variable while you, for instance, swapping the values. All right, let's move on. Maintainability, we mentioned that a little bit, and we're going to say a lot more about about this in our next presentation. Overall, you should design everything and code everything with maintainability in mind, with some maintainability in mind, which of course is something that some other piece that is here that plays an important role is to use comments as necessary. If there is something non-trivial, such as, for example, you could see a line of code that says, maybe it computes certain dates. And in that formula that it's using, it's using +1. And it's not immediately obvious why +1 is being used. Why is it this formula +1? You need to have a comment so that everybody's clear, including yourself. Because 3 months from now, if you have to make some changes or simply even understand how that works, because you have to write something similar, similar functionality, then this +1, you're going to look at it, you understand it's there and that it's important, but it may not be so obvious to understand why. Why +1 used in that formula that computes a certain calendar date. And in that case, a comment can be extremely helpful. And you'll realize in your career that sometimes you will be writing code, try to write a piece of code, non-trivial piece of code, come back to it in 1 year. Some people will simply not recognize, including myself, will just say, that could not be me writing this a year ago. Someone else wrote this. It's just that kind of phenomenon exists, and so commenting things properly is very important. So consistent code style, that includes indentation, consistent white space and indentation. And we already mentioned that static variables can be very evil, can make your code unsafe. And so you should rather be using instead of static variables, use instance variables that each object gets a copy of, or simply use local variables in your methods. Don't don't deceive yourself thinking that, oh, if I need to solve this particular problem, I just create another static variable. That's typically a wrong path to take. And sometimes there are an unnecessary, temporary variables also can be kind of hard to deal with. You could be recklessly just create a new temporary variable every time you want to compute something, but you could be reusing the same variable, and that kind of links together into the idea, pretty good link to the idea that sometimes an overcomplicated method needs to split into multiple methods, and so that it should be calling individual methods to perform parts of that task. And there, the possibility of unnecessary temporary variables kind of drops if that happens, because in that large method, there could be a lot of variables used, and they're all kind of exist in the same naming scope, and that may not be necessarily a good thing. So just some of these things to consider related to maintainability. All right. Again, we'll see examples of different stages of software development looking at our next presentation, but we should mention now that this process is highly iterative. And iterative sounds like a good thing oftentimes. It sounds like, today I work on some, we work on design. Tomorrow we may be working on writing some code. Then we realize we have to come back and update our design and write some more code. So we have those iterations of different activities. And typically the whole process is incremental, so that we're building on top of what's already been built, hopefully things done right. So we're trying to increase the amount of responsibilities that our classes need to be implementing, and all that happens. But unfortunately, which I already mentioned before, that oftentimes classes and programmers, once they understand the idea, the programmer starts doing their work, and oftentimes the actual code, the actual implementation that's written, the entire source code that's written sort of deviates from the original design. We mentioned before it's a challenge because someone has to go right back to the design and try to update it so that it reflects the true picture of what the software does. So that design oftentimes becomes outdated quickly. In addition to that, all comments that you write can also be have the same problem. You make changes in the code without paying much attention to the comments that surround that code, and the comments no longer true and actually become misleading. Oftentimes, I've been through this many times, that I look at what the code says and I look at the comment and I know they just disagree. They just completely disagree. The comment says it should be like deducting part, but when I look at the formula, it's adding that part. What's going on? So clearly, there's like some sort of clear disagreement between the comments and the actual code. So in that case, you need to trust the code. So oftentimes you need to look at the comment, and if it's your own comment, again, it comes with the territory that you need to maintain the comments all the time, just like you maintain the code. In certain programs, for example, programs written in assembly language, in machine codes, machine instructions, there typically you have two columns. One column is the actual machine instructions, and another column is the comments explaining what it does. Because by looking at just machine instructions, they're so abstract that it's very difficult to understand what is going on. But there is a list of comments on each step, each instruction, that explains then what really is happening. So comments are great when they're correct, right? So our responsibility is that if we have to make changes, then we also, part of that change is also make sure that we maintain the comments. Now, there are certain things, a few more things written on this particular slide, but let me first save this piece.